It is April 15th, 2025, and we're now getting insight into the 5 hours of talks that were held between President Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff and Russian President Putin, and some of the demands that Russia is putting forth for a possible deal that would be aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. But don't hold your breath for that deal, because as we're seeing unfolding this week, the propaganda machine here in the US is in full swing. That is an understatement. And you've got reports coming out saying that there's a bit of a divide within the Trump administration, right? There's some people who want to pursue a deal, want to do what Witkoff is doing, going and meeting with Russian officials, talking with them directly, trying to come to an agreement. And then that there are other members of the Trump administration, say Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who think that Trump needs to be putting pressure on Russia and essentially doing what the Biden administration just spent the last 3 years doing with no success. And all of this comes in the aftermath of an attack that was carried out by Russian forces in Ukraine's Sumy region. And we're really seeing conflicting stories surrounding how this attack was carried out, why it was carried out, and what the response should be. And I'm saying conflicting stories that are even coming from within the Trump administration. They can't seem to get their story straight in terms of how to respond to the overall conflict that's going on in the region. We are going to be getting into all of the latest and what it means for the ongoing tensions. But before we do, just a quick note to say we just hit 97,000 subscribers on YouTube. I am so grateful for each and every single one of you, and for those of you who are watching on other platforms as well. We are so incredibly close to 100,000 subscribers. I cannot even believe it. I can't believe how quickly it's coming together. I'm so grateful. I remember just a couple of years ago, I was hoping to hit 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. So to be at this milestone where we're at right now is just such a cool experience to be able to have. I know that I've poured a lot of time, energy, blood, sweat, and tears into building up this channel and building up this community. And so just wanted to take a moment to say thank you. If you are watching on YouTube, please make sure that you're subscribed. That way you are counted in that overall number. And we are so close to 100K. I'm looking forward to, I need to figure out some way to celebrate when we do get there, but I am very much looking forward to it. All right, now let's get into all of the latest. Now, I know we have a lot to cover when it comes to the reactions that we're seeing to Russia's recent attack in Ukraine's Sumy region, why that attack was carried out, and so on and so forth. But I actually want to start with what Mr. Steve Witkoff had to say about his recent direct meeting with Russian President Putin. This was actually their third in-person meeting in recent months. And Witkoff said that it went on for nearly 5 hours. He also said that it was towards the end when they started putting together a framework for what a possible deal would look like that would be aimed at ending the war in Ukraine.
This peace deal is about these so-called 5 territories, but there's so much more to it. There's security protocols. There's no NATO, Article 5. I mean, it's just, a lot of detail attached to it. It's a complicated situation.
Now, Witkoff didn't go too much into detail there. He kept it pretty broad, and this is pretty much what we've heard from Russia over and over again. I did think it was interesting, though, his mention of the 5 territories. So what is he talking about? Well, first and foremost, you, of course, have Crimea, which voted to join Russia back in 2014, voted to return to Russia more specifically, and has been acting as part of the Russian Federation ever since. You also have Donetsk and Lugansk, which voted to become independent regions, right? Declared their own independence in 2014 because they saw the Western-backed coup that was carried out in Kiev. They wanted no part of that, and so they proceeded accordingly. And then they voted to join Russia in referendums that were held back in September 2022. And then you have Kherson and Zaporozhye, which also were previously part of Ukraine and then voted to join Russia again in referendums that were held in September 2022. So you have these 5 territories, all with kind of different stories, but all of them are considered under Russian law part of the Russian Federation. So it makes sense that at the bare minimum, if we're talking about an agreement, Russia is calling for recognition of these territories. Now, I did mention this in a recent episode of Sanction, which I'll link below. It's not necessarily that Russia needs Western recognition of these territories. It's more so that it is literally the baseline, right? They are sitting there saying, look, we've spent over a decade now listening to the West say, oh, Russia annexed Crimea, right? Acting as if, oh, Russia forced all of these people under their control. So if Russia is dealing with Crimea as well as additional regions where people there have voted overwhelmingly to join the Russian Federation, then they're saying if there is going to be peace between us and the West, us and whoever is in charge in Kiev, then they have to have that recognition first and foremost. And I'll just add in here to say the fact that Putin has met with Witkoff 3 separate times and the fact that this meeting was nearly 5 hours is notable because, as we'll get into a little later on in this video, we're kind of seeing some members of the Trump administration, namely Marco Rubio, getting kind of frustrated with Russia right now, kind of throwing it out there that maybe Russia doesn't want peace. Maybe they're not serious about coming to some sort of an agreement. Maybe they're just dragging out this dialogue. And to a certain extent, yeah, they are dragging out this dialogue because they can, because time is on their side, because as Donald Trump himself previously admitted, Russia has the cards here. They don't have to make a deal. They are not in the position that Kiev is in right now, and they're also not in the position that the U.S. is in right now. So because they have time on their side, because they have all of those advantages, yeah, they're going to use them. Yeah, they're going to lay out their demands and say, hey, this is what is required in order for us to agree to some sort of a deal. And people like Marco Rubio don't have to like it, but guess what? There's not much they can do to change the reality of the situation on the battlefield. And as much as they hate it, I do think that they are aware of it. But then there's also the Kiev factor, because the reality is that, look, Witkoff and Putin, they can have negotiations. Trump and Putin, they can have talks, and they can come up with some pretty little deal. They can slap a bow on it and say, you know what? The U.S. is going to agree to recognize these 5 regions as part of Russia. They're going to agree that Ukraine will never become a NATO member, right? That there is going to be a neutral status that is required for Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And they can sign a deal. But what's to say that Kiev is going to agree to that? Because as we've already seen, when Trump and Putin agreed to a limited partial ceasefire involving the targeting of energy infrastructure, it took about 5 minutes for Moscow to come out and say, hey, we have evidence that Kiev has violated this agreement. And we have yet to see any evidence from the Trump administration that Mr. Trump went over to Mr. Zelensky and said, hey, we agreed to this partial ceasefire. You need to comply with it. Instead, the Trump administration just sits back and is like, we can only do so much to control Kiev. And because of that, because you're not seeing any legitimate pressure put on Zelensky, then what does he do? He sits down for a recent interview with CBS 60 Minutes, and he says that, well, first and foremost, he admits that Kiev is not going to be able to retake those territories. But instead of just saying, you know what, we're respecting the will of the people who live there, we're giving it up to Russia, those people have decided that they want to be part of Russia, we're allowing that to happen because there's not much we can do otherwise. Then he says, we'll agree to a quote-unquote diplomatic end to the war, but we will never agree to recognize those territories.
Нам не вистачає сил деокупувати все. І це зрозуміла ситуація на сьогодні. І тому дипломатично ця війна закінчиться. Ми не визнаємо території руськими, ті, які тимчасово окуповані.
And the fact that Zelensky is not saying something like that in private and then it's being leaked and we're finding out his true feelings. Oh no, he's saying that out in public. He's saying that in an interview that he knows is going to be broadcast to a Western audience. Because of that, he's literally proving Russia's point right there, which is Number one, Kiev cannot be trusted. Number two, any sort of deal that the West is able to corral Kiev into has the potential to turn into the next version of the Minsk agreement, right? A Minsk III deal where we freeze the conflict for a minute. And then the danger is that NATO is able to rearm the Kiev regime and prepare them for the next phase of war with Russia. And it is essentially a never-ending war that is just frozen for a little bit, which Russia has said repeatedly. I don't know how many more times they can say it, but they have made it known that that is unacceptable to them. And if there's anything you can guarantee from the US establishment, it's that they always want more and more war. And we're seeing that right now, as in the aftermath of a recent Russian attack carried out in Ukraine's Sumy region. Oh, the establishment has gone full force to make it clear that this should be what leads to the Trump administration beating the war drums against Russia, right? Imposing more sanctions, trying to do everything in their power to quote unquote put more pressure on Russia because they say of this one attack. Now, the initial report from the Associated Press was that Russia launched 2 ballistic missiles into the Ukrainian city of Sumy on Sunday morning, killing 34 people and injuring over 100 others, including several children. The report also noted the presence of multiple black body bags on the streets after the attack. They had photos galore, and so the story spread like wildfire. Russia's defense ministry, however, says that it was targeting a meeting of the Ukrainian military's commanding officers and that it killed more than 60 of them. The report also noted that other Ukrainian lawmakers said there was an award ceremony held for the troops in the area and that Russia had gotten word of the gathering. And even the mayor of Sumy is now faulting the regional governor for planning a military ceremony in this region that is so close to the front line. And it does make you wonder, why are we gathering all of these troops together here? Why are we holding this ceremony here? And was it something that was done deliberately, right? Was it just something that they were dumb enough to do, hope that Russia wouldn't catch wind of it, and that they wouldn't take notice to the fact that, as the Wall Street Journal reported, the Russian military strike killed a Ukrainian colonel who was a commander of a Ukrainian artillery brigade that is equipped with advanced US HIMARS rocket launchers? Or was it deliberate? Was there some sort of bait that they were hoping that Russia would take, hoping that civilians would be killed, and then that they would have another excuse to offer this attack up on a silver platter to the West and to say, look what Russia did. They killed civilians, and therefore the West should continue in an endless war and escalate to World War III. And just to be clear here, the killing of every innocent civilian is tragic, right? No matter where they are in the world, no matter whether it's Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, Lebanon, the list goes on and on. It is absolutely tragic. But look at the way that the mainstream media here in the West is using what they say is the killing of civilians. They're using it to call for more and more war. They're using it to call for more escalations against Russia instead of calling for an end to this war. Instead of looking at the war in Ukraine and saying, how in the world did we get into this, and how do we get out of it? How was it allowed to continue on for this long? And I'm not saying that, oh, their answer needs to be that they need to put more pressure on Russia, because that's how we got to this point. The refusal to talk to Russia, the thought that, oh, we're just going to hit Russia with all of these sanctions. We're going to try to completely isolate and destroy its economy. The idea that that is somehow the answer to the violence that we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine is how you get more and more war. The refusal to listen to Russia, when for years now they have said, these are our security concerns. These are what need to be addressed. This is what NATO needs to stop doing as they're encroaching closer and closer to our territory. All of those things, all of those warning signs that were ignored got us to where we are at this point right now, where innocent civilians are being killed on the ground. And this idea here in the West and in some members of the Trump administration that anytime an innocent civilian is killed in Ukraine, that, oh, that means that the US needs to rise up against Russia. And And do what? Because that's another aspect to the conversation. What are they going to do? Because the reality is there's not much that they can do against Russia, short of World War III. But of course, that logic, or maybe the lack thereof, has not stopped at least some members in the Trump administration from calling for more pressure against Russia anyway. At least that's according to the latest reports. As you have the Wall Street Journal reporting that there is now a divide within the Trump administration and that certain figures like Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Ukraine-Russia Envoy Keith Kellogg are putting pressure on the president to take a harder line against Putin. Now, it's interesting to me that the two main figures that they name here are Kellogg and Rubio, because as we know, when it comes to Keith Kellogg, he really hasn't been involved in these US-Russia talks. In fact, it's even been reported that the Russian government straight up said that they wanted nothing to do with him, that they did not want him to be the guy to handle talks because he was a bit too close to Ukraine. And they said that they would deal with Steve Witkoff, who's supposed to be Trump's Middle East envoy, instead. But as for Mr. Marco Rubio, now I will always know him as a lifelong warmonger. I do not buy this new version, this Marco Rubio 2.0 that's now talking about how it's not normal to have a unipolar world, right? That we need to pursue a multipolar world order, blah, blah, blah. I don't buy it. I think that he's smart enough to know that he needs to reinvent himself a little bit and he needs to kind of go along with the Trump way of doing things, at least as Trump is presenting it right now, in the sense that Trump doesn't want World War III against Russia, therefore Rubio's not going to pursue that. However, I would not be surprised whatsoever, and I have no evidence that he is putting pressure on Trump privately, but it would not surprise me if this report was accurate and if that was the case. If Rubio was in private, at least telling Trump, we need to put more pressure on Russia, we need to do XYZ. In public, however, Rubio is being careful. As in a post on X, he called the attack in Sumy horrifying and said that it was a tragic reminder of why President Trump and his administration are putting so much time and effort into trying to end this war and achieve durable peace. Now, Rubio is also getting criticism for not publicly condemning Russia, or I guess saying more to condemn Russia for the attack in that statement. He's probably not saying that or not throwing out that condemnation because of the way that Trump is treating this, the fact that he also called it horrible, but said that he believed that the attack was a mistake. But beyond that, that doesn't mean that Rubio isn't talking. As earlier this month, he told reporters in Brussels, following a NATO gathering, that, quote, we will know soon enough in a matter of weeks, not months, whether Russia is serious about peace or not, and that the US is losing patience with talks about talks. And I'm guessing that talks about talks is how Rubio would describe that nearly 5-hour meeting that Steve Witkoff just held with Russian President Putin. But it brings me back to the point. Okay, what can the US do? What can they do? Can they force a peace deal on Russia? No. Can they force Russia to hurry up and to accept their demands, to hurry up and to accept a full ceasefire? No. This coming Sunday, Easter Sunday, was supposed to be the day when a ceasefire was in place, according to multiple reports that were floating around as Trump was getting into office. Guess what's not happening by this Sunday? A full ceasefire. Not that the Trump administration hasn't tried. They've tried. They've talked to Russia. They've done what they can. They've had multiple different meetings between American and Russian officials. But the point is, Russia holds the cards here. So this idea that Rubio's saying, oh, we'll find out if Russia is serious about peace. Okay, well, what if you feel like they're not serious about peace? Then what are you going to do? And I think that Trump understands that. To a certain extent, he's not exactly showing that. But it is interesting the rhetoric that he's using, because this is one of the criticisms I've had of Trump, is that he is now fully responsible, fully complicit for the U.S. proxy war against Russia under his second term, right? Yes, obviously the Biden administration has its responsibility for it. I would argue that the Trump administration has its responsibility, which took place during its first term, as you've heard Trump brag about giving javelins to Kiev, right, and to Ukrainian forces. He's bragged about that. Those weapons were used against Russia. Guess what? Trump also played a role in it during his first term, and now he's doing the exact same thing during his second. And although, yes, the US is talking to Russia, I will give credit where credit is due. I keep getting comments saying that I'm being too anti-Trump or too critical of Trump. I will give him credit for talking to Russia, absolutely. But at the same time, I also have to mention the fact that he is actively keeping the US involved in this war. He cut off military aid and intelligence sharing for a week, about 5 minutes in the grand scheme of things, and then he gave it right back. And when he gave it right back, he made it so that his administration is now directly responsible, right, for every attack that is carried out by Ukrainian forces using intelligence that was straight from the US. That is another way in which Trump is directly responsible for being a direct party to this war. And yet Trump keeps flip-flopping on Zelensky, on how he seems to feel about Zelensky. And that was evident this week once again in the Oval Office.
He's always looking to purchase missiles. You know, he's against, listen, when you start a war, you got to know that you can win the war, right? You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people give you some missiles.
Now, anyone who has paid attention to the last several years, say more than a decade of tensions between the US and Russia, is well aware that we are not seeing a war in Ukraine right now because of Zelensky. Zelensky is the US puppet. At some point, he will officially be the US fall guy, right? The demise of Zelensky, everything will be blamed on him. And that's what Trump has been setting up since he first got into office. Sure, he'll say he tried to work with him, but that didn't end up working out. But I think what you're seeing from Trump right now is this realization that there's only so much that the US can do, right? They can't force Russia into a peace deal. They can't force Russia to end this war. But at the same time, they also can only do so much to force Ukraine into a peace deal. They also can only do so much to force the Kiev regime and all of the violent right-wing extremists in Kiev that have been playing a major factor in the direction of the government there in the aftermath of the Western-backed coup in Kiev back in 2014, that there's only so much the US can do to try to get them to work with Russia. Because again, they've spent the last 11 years and more so, but the last 11 years publicly pushing them in a direction where they will be in a forever war with Russia. So if Trump really does want to get out of it, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's yet another reminder that US foreign policy continues to be determined by the US establishment. Because even if we see a winding down of the war in Ukraine, even if we see the US and Russia back away from the cliff that is World War III, we still have the US actively supporting genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. We still have the US threatening tensions or maybe an all-out war against Iran. And we still have the US actively preparing for war against China. The war machine does not stop. It does not come to a halt just because there's some new guy in office. It continues on, it changes directions, and it continues to threaten not only the countries it targets, but also the US and its standing in the world as a whole. And that's something everyone should be talking about. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.